This week, we discuss AppSec Cali and AppSec strategies. In the news segment, OpenBSD sees an RCE for mishandling email, Microsoft sees bugs in Azure Stack and bounties in Xbox. The NCSC shares zero trust for everyone to see, and more. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. As the world of software-driven everything becomes a reality and development cycles speed up, sales teams are taking a new approach to application security, one that enables security teams to scale by empowering developers to integrate security into their development workflows and tool sets, all while giving security teams the visibility and control they need. Snyk helps software-driven businesses develop fast and stay secure with a developer-first solution that seamlessly and proactively finds and fixes vulnerabilities in open source libraries and containers. Learn more and see the solution for yourself at securityweekly.com/Snyk. Nearly every business today relies on mobile applications, yet the vast majority do not adequately secure them. Once downloaded, mobile apps escape your control outside the secure network perimeter, thus making them easy targets for hackers. Enter GuardSquare. From the makers of ProGuard, GuardSquare integrates transparently and seamlessly into the development process, adding multiple layers of protection to Android and iOS applications, and effectively hardening apps against both on-device and off-device attacks. Request a demo today of GuardSquare at securityweekly.com/GuardSquare. Synopsys is the leader in application security testing. With 84% of cyber attacks targeting the application layer, securing your software is more challenging than ever. Modern software development and deployment paradigms require security testing solutions that are automated, accurate, and integrate into your DevOps workflow. Synopsys enables DevSecOps with a portfolio of industry-leading tools, including Coverity, Black Duck, and Seeker, to help you build secure, high-quality software faster. Visit securityweekly.com/synopsys to learn more.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 94, recorded February 3rd, 2020. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Matt Alderman. Hey, Matt.
Happy Monday. Well, maybe
Happy
not
Monday.
Happy for the San Francisco fans, actually.
Well, it's not as happy as it could be. That is a very good point. And I don't know. We've also got John Kinsella here. So, John, I don't know how happy your Monday is faring.
Yeah, I'm not totally thrilled either, but as I keep saying to people, the Niners are partially dead to me once they actually moved out of San Francisco, so still could have gone better.
Still could have gone better. Words to live by for anyone running an AppSec program, I'm sure, as well. Join us at InfoSec World 2020, March 30 through April 1st at the Disney Contemporary Resort. Security Weekly listeners save 15% off the InfoSec World main conference or World Pass. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW2020 and click the register button to register with our discount code. Our next webcast is February 13th with Sri Sundaralingam, Vice President, Product and Solutions Marketing at ExtraHop, where we will discuss cloud-native network detection and response. Register for our upcoming webcasts by visiting securityweekly.com, selecting the webcast drop-down from the top menu bar and clicking registration. Well, even if this Monday isn't great for everyone who's in San Francisco, this month, well, I guess I can't say this month, man, January disappeared on us. January was a good month for anyone who wanted to head down to Santa Monica and hang out on the beach and visit AppSec California 2020 and listen to some great presentations. As the name implies, obviously, it's a bit of a focus of application security. And this year had a keynote started off with Alex Stamos talking about tech and election security. But one of the other things that really caught my eye was a presentation from Clint Gibbler, who's a pen tester, a consultant over at NCC Group. And he referenced over 50 presentations and his background doing application security for many, many years to basically put together some strategies or basically put together some themes that he's seen be successful strategies for organizations that are scaling application security. And there were many, many things I liked about this presentation, not the least of which is that it's actually a talk that references and gives credit to many other talks. But also, he starts off with some very good assumptions. One is that you're just deploying a SAST or DAST tool isn't the beginning and end of your application security program. It's got to be something bigger than that. It is setting up front that it's looking for groups, for organizations, for teams that are willing to invest in some of these themes that we'll get to in a second. And I think the final point that he mentions very early in his talk is that he's also coming from the perspective that your security team actually isn't massive and you don't have a massive budget. So you are not a Google or Facebook where you can have hundreds of people in your security org and your budget is easily in the millions of dollars. So these are themes, these are techniques and approaches to scale that hopefully anybody can take. So before we dive into a bit more of it, I'm not sure, Matt or John, what have you been following AppSec Cali this year? Was there anything else that you wanted to highlight or that struck you from the presentations this year?
Nah,
Not general for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, same thing. It's every year there's one of those shows that there's always good talks at, whether it's AppSec USA or how they name it. My biggest wish is I'd gone on the one a few years ago. I think they were trying to do it on a boat. I think they did, but yeah, I didn't get to one this year. As usual, it'll take me. Beside the ones that sort of float up to the top, and you hear, wow, these are great talks. I spend the next week or two after shows like this actually sort of catching up on stuff when I can.
Well, and so that's what we're going to spend the next 30 minutes talking about this one particular talk. They haven't posted the other videos, so we will keep all of our listeners updated when OAPS Cali posts the rest of the videos. But in this case, there were about 4 main points that Clint was making. And it started off with, before we even get into those points, just saying, have something, have your application security program start with secure defaults. And that's one of those things that's easily said, but maybe a little bit difficult to do. And the example he gave was one of my favorite examples of, rather than dive into SAST and DAST and figure out CSP policies for preventing XSS, start off with something like React, and then just look for any setting of dangerously set inner HTML. And that is the one, just grepping for that well-named and insecure function is one of the best ways you can start to deploy SAST for your front end. But
before,
go ahead.
I want to back up one step because he has this really interesting section on mindsets and principles before we get into some of the defaults. And I like these because I think it's something we've been talking about a lot. And so I wanted to back up to his big picture for a second and just maybe hit those 4 points before we dig into some of the specifics on from a security perspective.
Yeah, and so let's hit those. So great themes of automate as much as possible. Obviously, DevOps itself is predicated on what the heck can we automate and why haven't we automated everything yet? Also, the idea of guardrails, not gatekeepers. Basically, rather than the security team saying, no, don't do that, say, that sounds hard. Here's an easier way to do things, or here's a more secure way. Also talks about high signal, low noise tools and alerting, meaning if you're going to automate or if you're going to deploy something, make sure it's actually useful. And then another great point here that I think it's last, but definitely not least, is developers are your customers. So when we talk about DevOps, or if we want to say DevSecOps, and we want to play around with that terminology, security really being the glue that either the glue that ties that together, or basically security is sprinkled within the DevOps process. And for the developers to adopt it, why not make it friendly to them? So
exactly.
Those, I think,
so a couple things here that I think are really important for people to understand is that when we talk about security and these different security tools and we dig into SAST and DAST and all the other things, I think one of the most important things that came out of the section is high signal, low noise means integration into existing tools that the developers use that are giving them very relevant information instantly that allows them to make changes and tweaks as they continue their development process. And I think that's something we forget sometimes as security professionals. We've got all these great tools, and we just think the developers are going to come into our tools and look for all this data. It's not going to happen that way. So the reason I wanted us to back up a little bit on this section, Mike, was he brings out some really good points about as we continue to automate to get scale, integration is a big part of this, because we need to serve the developers who really are our customers from a security perspective to make sure that they're getting the data they need to build better, more secure code.
Absolutely. And he goes into there's quite a bit of discussion around different ways of addressing the tooling or popping the tooling into that particular, where do you put it, either within the maturity of your organization or within the pipeline for developers to consume. And making a great point about, rather than just the idea of signals versus noise, rather than just trying to find all of these small bugs or flaws, targeting bug classes. And that was a little bit of that lead in with that discussion of React, that rather than trying to find all of the fancy ways that cross-site scripting can appear and all the different payloads that can happen, why not consider a way to have a front end that's just more resistant to cross-site scripting in the first place, and then have simpler tooling that can give you, when it does trigger something, gives you much higher confidence that, in fact, here is an alert that somebody should pay attention to and follow up on, rather than here's the alert that just goes straight to the junk bin or straight to the ignore just because you have alert fatigue. And so right off the bat, those are great ideas to start with. He's also talking about, I guess we'll move a little bit into the vulnerability and detection, because he spends quite a bit of time talking about that, but he uses that to illustrate some of these aspects, saying, for example, that when you start to target those vulns, consider where automation can help you, but also where automation won't. And that's where he talks about bringing bug bounty programs into that, using pen testing for more complex, harder issues that bug bounty programs either can find, but aren't very focused on in a time-bound manner, and then start building on your runtime monitoring for bugs that are really hard or just really inefficient to look for. And that's where you engage your DevOps team to say, where can we put more logging, where can we put more monitoring on to find these problems?
It's sort of, I've been digging through and rereading this as you guys were talking, and this deck should be required reading for, like, this is homework for anyone listening to this right now. Go out to the wiki, to Application Security Weekly wiki, Application Security Weekly wiki. Say that 5 times fast.
Written by a Wookiee.
Go grab this, download it, read it. It's almost 200 slides. I mean, he's so close. I don't know why he didn't just add 4 slides to make it 200. There's so much good stuff in here, but sort of, back focused around what we're talking about right now. It's those tools and the vulnerability management components. But I think the biggest thing, and I think I said last week, I've been on a usability kick the last month or so, and this just sort of right around what you're talking about again, and what a lot of points in this deck is. So this deck is sort of the slide deck version of the ITIL security book. It wasn't called the ITIL security, but it's basically, if you read any of Gene Kim's little black and yellow books, you're like, oh my God, I've been thinking about this for years. I'm glad someone wrote it down. This is sort of similar to that, but it really comes down to 2 things, usability and time, in my mind. There's so much stuff in here I'd love to do. And a lot of it that we do here, I've done in previous lives, but like to do all this stuff time and time again and to keep it up to date, that's sort of the difficult part, at least to me. But then making it usable, and I think the more usable it is, the easier it is to use. The ability to keep it up to date becomes a little easier. So around vulnerability management, a few years ago, that was talking about either package based, or we can go back further and talk about network scans and that type of thing, right? Where do you find your vulnerabilities? And I think in sort of our AppSec space, where we're talking about here now, that's becoming really more and more granular. So I think it's something for folks to think about. It's you can't just take any of these tools or these concepts, but you're constantly refining on them. I think something I saw in here somewhere was sort of hard to summarize this down. There's so much stuff in here. But in one of the slides, he was talking about we have some of these components. We don't need to focus or think about them as much. But yeah, you're always going back and finding more details and how to improve. We don't get to rest easy in this space. So yeah,
I do like how he laid out the vulnerability complexity, because he starts with the thing we talk about a lot, which is secure defaults, like configuration, like basic configuration management, right? Which isn't really sexy and definitely has created a lot of angst with a lot of attacks. And then he talks, then he goes to automated tools and then bug bounties, pen tests, and runtime. And sometimes, and this is why I think it's so important, I think I'm on slide 20. If you look at this, think about how most people are approaching AppSec for a second, right? They're chasing like maybe the automated tools or the runtime protection or maybe a bug bounty program, but they skipped over that whole big first section of secure defaults. And he emphasizes this over and over and over again as he goes through this, is that we have to validate our configuration as one of those starting points. It should be pretty easy to do. It's table stakes, and then you do all this other stuff, but we're doing all the other stuff and forgetting about secure defaults.
Yeah, I think one of the things is I'd put a little bit of an editorial or editing hat on here and maybe reorder some of the narrative that's being built here. Because just as you were talking about the vuln scanning and the vuln management, there's a precursor to that of also threat modeling. And meaning, that leads to, well, here are a bunch of risks, here are, our valuable assets, but what could we, basically that question, here's what we're building, here's what could go wrong. And when we start to talk about, well, what are we going to do about it? Secure defaults becomes a great first step. And that threat modeling, he does talk about, how can you automate that? He does mention like self-service questionnaires. I think there was also an example or two about some annotating code or labeling code with your threat modeling, the threat modeling's code. That, I will say, I haven't seen that be particularly successful or particularly scalable yet. That could also just be my observer bias. But I would point to perhaps something that isn't quite automated, but is something that is much easier to do from a process perspective from threat modeling is check out Mozilla's rapid risk assessment. And I think I forgot to drop a link to that in the show notes. I'll do that right after this. But it's basically predicated on, here is a 30 to 45 minute discussion to have with developers about a small component or a small area, and say, let's actually prioritize what we're going to do from a threat modeling perspective and what we're going to basically spend our time on protecting. Because once we shift from threat modeling into vulnerability management, we've also then, we should have actually even been talking about asset inventory from the very beginning. And he spends some time, so a good amount of time, talking about asset inventory, because again, that's going to be a very familiar topic to all InfoSec practitioners, but it's one of those things that's often more easily said than done.
Yeah, especially especially where we are with applications now. Think about the proliferation of containers and microservices. Asset inventory gets a heck of a lot harder in these new architecture environments, but it's still very important to understand what's out there, what's running, maybe what should certain microservices be communicating to. Can't protect what you don't know is out there on your network, whether it's in the cloud or on-prem. So these are still very key principles, but sometimes we kind of gloss over them.
They do. And one of the things that I think is, on the one hand, I think we've mentioned this before too, that cloud and containers ostensibly give us better and easier ways to get visibility into our inventory, because all the cloud service providers, they for sure know how to charge you and bill you for the resources you're consuming. So that should also imply they know exactly what resources you have. And two examples here. One was discussing lift cartography and its associated presentation from B-Sides SF last year. And that's a tool for helping with asset inventory. But then there's also, goes beyond just say, the idea that we're not just building an asset inventory for the sake of just knowing what we have. we can then start to interrogate it. And that's some good examples that Clint is building up here is, for example, he gives two. What RDS instances have encryption turned off? And that can start us on a discussion, too, about what does encryption look like in the cloud for data in transit, data at rest, and so on. Another easy question for our asset inventory, or what should be easy, I'll say easy to ask, what EC2 instances are directly exposed to the internet? And are we surprised by that? Because there's quite often you can encounter instances that are spun up in dev or staging environments, or VPCs change, or different networking rules change, and an instance that was just supposed to be a personal developer's experiment is suddenly exposed to the internet, can cause problems, especially given what other systems that it can pivot to or what data it has access to.
Sorry, I'm deep in thought. You're saying things which make me think. I think there's startup ideas around some of this stuff, and I'll get back to that in a second. But on this one, part of the issue, what's going on right now, because what you're just saying, Mike, really comes back to asset management again. And one of the things that I've seen over the last year is it really comes down a little bit to, at least from with my vendor hat on. One of the things I'm seeing is what we provide as asset inventory really varies based for what an individual customer is looking for. So take containers, for example, or VMs sort of, but containers are so sort of fly by the night that really happens here. Some customers want to see every container ever created because they're still sort of trying to figure out that concept of ephemerality, versus some just want to see what's actually still living or still exists. So, and there's some benefits to both aspects of that. So asset inventory just as a thing itself is also sort of changing. It's not just the can you keep track of everything, but what type of things do you want to keep track of? Do you want to keep, do you want to have fond memories of container 59 that was alive for 5 seconds 2 days ago? Or do you want to just know what's actually your vulnerability footprint looks like right now? So it's some of the things around it are actually changing too, and I think that's something interesting for folks to think about, what they want.
Yeah, and he also mentions even with cloud and instances like having invariant, or basically deploy and then burn those down and then redeploy with the next patch level, with the next version of third-party libraries on it, and so on. And again, I think I wanted to highlight that he's also presenting not just observations of problems that teams are running into, but some actionable things that teams can follow, pick and choose depending on their level of maturity. And I'll throw everybody into slide 109, which I think is a great way to think about this, because he's talking about becoming more highly leveraged with your time. You can always, let's say you have a somewhat unlimited budget. You can always spend more money on a problem, but it's quite hard to spend more time on a problem if you're considering trying to scale up with just people. And that's where I think automation can come in, talking about high signal, low noise type of alerting. Talking about also lots of long-term investments rather than just what's the latest flaw of the day, or what's, how many different bugs can we find today. More of how many different bugs can we get rid of, or bug classes, can we actually address. And then also, we didn't get to it too much right now, but that idea of quantifying risk, which is always going to be, I think, much more of a art than science, but at least having some sort of framework to be working from, to be saying, where this time and money that we've invested, we actually think we're investing it well, or where we're seeing a return on that, or we have something that we can demonstrate its effectiveness on.
Yeah, and we're starting to see products emerge in this space to start to address some of these, right? So if we go back to our old network security scanning days, because we've all been there in our past, you now have more mature tools that are trying to prioritize those vulnerabilities, et cetera. We're now starting to see this happen in the application space, where we can start to take vulnerability data from various tools, because it might be a static analysis or dynamic, or might be from looking at your code repositories and all your libraries and stuff, right? So they're all starting to come together, that we have start to get a better handle on, okay, what are all the potential vulnerabilities? Which ones might be more risky that I want to address? Those are just starting to emerge to help with that prioritization. Then you can do things like look for, whole classes of potential vulnerabilities that maybe I can eliminate through a React interface or something like that. And then you go to kind of that next step where you can start to automate some of these other pieces like least privilege. He talks a lot about least privilege. We've talked about it here in machine-to-machine identity and privilege. And then the invariance, which is all the fun stuff with our cloud infrastructure and all those other things. But we're still early in this process. I think the network security side is a lot more mature. Application security is finally starting to catch up, and some really interesting solutions starting to evolve to address these different pieces on slide 109.
No, absolutely. And for as much as we're early in this process, and unfortunately, Matt, we're late in this segment. And while I won't make you give up root, I think I'm going to have to make you give up more of the chat for the day, because we need to take a quick break, and then we're going to return with news of the week.